Welcome, everyone. First of all, apologies because my voice is a little bit down today, having indeed given quite a few talks in the past few days. So if I'm a little bit hard to hear, I'm sorry about that. But hopefully, I actually have a deeper voice than usual. So maybe that gives me more authority than I usually have. I don't know. Lionel, we don't mention, I should say this, we don't mention the Bayes theorem in this book, but you should know that we teach it in HEC. In fact, yesterday I was teaching an entire course on how to use Bayesian thinking, not Bayesian networks, about which I know nothing and I'm keen to learn, but Bayesian reasoning and Bayesian thinking. It's amazing, by the way, when you ask your students in an MBA class at the beginning of the class, who has heard the name Bayes, that only a couple of hands go up. So you guys are doing something useful, and there's still a way to go in making Bayesian thinking trickle down to the world of practice and not just to the world of academia. Now, I'm hoping that I will learn a lot from your comments on what I say about this book. So I'm going to try to keep my talk relatively short to cover the gist of what the book is about in about 30 minutes and to leave the rest of the time for questions and comments. And I'm especially keen to hear your questions, but also your thoughts, your comments about what you think we've missed, what you think we should do differently, and what you think the research program on this topic of noise should be going forward. Because as Danny likes to say when he introduces the book to an academic audience, if he weren't 82 when we started writing it, he would have started by doing 10 years of research and then written the book. In fact, because he was 82 when we started 5 years ago, we had to do it the other way around, and we hope that this will trigger a lot of research. But there is clearly a lot of research to be done. There are a lot of questions we don't have the answers to. There are a lot of tools to reduce noise, which is the topic of the book, that haven't been discovered yet. And folks like you are uniquely well placed to contribute to that research and to those developments. So let me perhaps walk you quickly through the argument of the book about what noise is, which I'm sure will be familiar to you, but in fact, we use it in a slightly different definition from the one that you probably use in your AI work, why it matters and what people should do about it. The initial setting in which we observed noise and the motivation for the book, in a way, was an observation that Danny and a few of his colleagues made in an insurance company. The insurance company, like every insurance company, has underwriters who are, whose job it is to use their expert judgment to price an insurance policy, to set the level of the premium. To do that, they have to assess the risk that a complex insurance policy represents in terms of probability and in terms of amount that they would have to pay in the event of a claim. Now, of course, this is not to insure your car. This is to insure a factory against fire or a bank against fraud or something like that. So these are big risks, and it takes an expert to make a judgment about how much those risks are worth. The question we asked, Danny asked the executives of the insurance company at the time, and we've asked hundreds of people since then, is if you take two of these experts whose job it is to make those judgments, who have been making such judgments for many years, who are using the same tools and the same procedures and the same rules that the insurance company has set for them, and who, before they came into the insurance company, trained as actuaries who are well versed in all the tools of the trade. So if you take two of these people and you give them exactly the same problem, basically you ask them both for a quote, assuming that they don't know what the other guy is doing, how much of a difference would there be between them? Now, when we ask the executives in an insurance company, their answer is, of course, well, we expect there to be a difference. These people aren't machines. But, we expect the difference to be modest. We expect bounded disagreement. That's not their phrase, it's ours. But typically, people tell us we expect a bit less than 10%. We think that if there was a difference of 10%, it would still be manageable. It would still be tolerable from a business standpoint in the insurance company. The surprise is that when you do the experiment, it's not the 10% you expect that you find, it's a median difference of 55%. So in half of the pairs of underwriters that you randomly select when you do an experiment like this, the difference between their estimates of the same risk is more than 55%. That's 55% as a percentage of the average. If we, as you see here, if we measure it as a percentage of the lower number, it's actually a lot more. So this makes a mockery of the whole process of expertise. And you have to wonder, if you're the insurance company, why you are asking those experts to set prices at all. And by the way, how on earth you've been blind to this problem for so many years? How is it possible that you haven't noticed that there was such absurd variability in the judgments of your experts? That was the motivation for the book. Now, before we proceed, one question that we very often get, typically from less expert crowds than the one we have here, but it's still important to mention it, is that there are many topics on which this isn't a problem. Variation, differences of opinion, differences of judgments are welcome in many, many, many ways, in many fields. Sorry. They're welcome when we're talking about matters of tastes. If you like Vermeer and I prefer Picasso, well, that's fine. We're allowed to have different tastes. If we are both trying to find a technological solution to a difficult problem, and we're taking different routes to the solution, that's fine. One of us will succeed, or maybe both, and we'll have two solutions and they will compete in the marketplace. If we are in a market and you're buying because you think the price of a stock will go up, and I'm selling because I think the price of that stock will go down, well, in a week or in a month or in 3 months, we'll figure out who was right and who was wrong. And again, variation will have been beneficial because there is a selection after the variation, which is the good old Darwinian idea. The problem we have when we're talking about the underwriters is that these underwriters work for the same enterprise. They work in the same department. They are supposed to be interchangeable. The only reason why you get one underwriter to give you a quote and not the other is because he happens to be available, whereas on that particular day, the other one is on holidays or having lunch. And there are many situations like that where professionals make judgments that are made just by one individual, but that commit the entire organization. When you go to a hospital and you see a doctor, the doctor you see is the doctor you see. You don't get to see every doctor in the hospital. If you see two doctors and that they disagree about your diagnosis, it doesn't mean that one of them is creative. It doesn't mean that one of them is innovative. It doesn't mean that one of them, has diversity. It just means that one of them, at least, is wrong. The same is true when you're making hiring decisions, when you're making judicial decisions, when you're making all kinds of decisions that are judgments because they are made under uncertainty and by experts, and where we expect that people will converge towards the correct answer. Whether or not the correct answer will be known at some point is another consideration, by the way. Sometimes we're talking about predictions where we will know the correct answer. We will be able at some point in time to evaluate who is right. Even when we're not talking about a prediction, noise is problematic. Take judicial decisions. We're going to see the example in a minute. Sorry. When people who are identically situated are judged differently by different judges, that's a problem, even though you don't know which judgment is closer to the ideal, optimal, or correct judgment, because it's difficult to define such a thing. So this is the first basic idea. Wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and there is usually much more of it than you think. Wherever humans are in charge of making judgments, the very nature of judgment implies that there will be divergences between them, that there will be noise. The surprise and the motivation for the book is that there is a lot more of it than people expect. It's not the existence of noise that is a surprise. Of course, when we say something is a matter of judgment, we imply that reasonable people are allowed to disagree. That's the definition of a matter of judgment. The problem is that the extent of that disagreement is, as we've seen in the insurance example, much greater than we typically expect. It's important to stress, and this will be obvious to you guys, that as we show in this little picture that Lionel was showing earlier, this is a very different problem from bias. When we have bias, we have something like this. I hardly need to explain this to you. Noise, on the other hand, is something like this. And very often, we have a combination of noise and bias, and people pay attention to the bias for reasons we can discuss if you're interested, and they are usually completely oblivious to the noise, which, of course, causes as many errors, if not more, as bias. Here are a few examples. Talent management, when you are talking about hiring decisions, the degree of agreement between different interviewers who see the same candidate is quite low. And by the way, the quality of the predictions that people make when they make hiring decisions is quite bad. If you think that's bad, there's worse. Performance ratings are even worse than hiring decisions. Roughly speaking, and to summarize a lot of research on this, when you get a performance evaluation from your boss, about 1/4 of the variance in those performance evaluations has something to do with you and your performance. The remaining 3/4 are a combination of your boss's level of judgments in general and the boss's interaction with you, which basically means whether she likes you or not. 1/4 signal, 3/4 noise. Not a great process to rely upon. Criminal justice, I mentioned this briefly. There are many studies on this. The most compelling one is actually an old one, where 208 federal judges in the US were asked to say what sentence they would give to a number of defendants in 16 different cases, which were described in fairly simple terms, but the simplicity here should reduce the noise because there are fewer details on which people can, to which people can respond. Despite the fact that these cases were fairly stripped down and simplified, the noise, the variability that is entirely attributable to the judge, right? These are the same cases evaluated by different judges. The variability is more than half of the average sentence. For an average sentence of 7 years, the mean difference between two judges is almost 4 years. That means that it means not that judges take into account the specifics of each case, which of course they should. It means that the sentence is to a very large extent a function of the judge who happens to pass the sentence. And that obviously is not what the founding fathers in the US intended, I assume, because we can expect that there is great wisdom in our judges and still think that the variation shouldn't be that large. Another example, again, in the justice system. In the same courthouse in Miami, in this example, there are two judges. In fact, there are more than two, but let's just pick two. There are two judges who make asylum decisions. The candidates, the asylum applicants, are attributed to them randomly by the luck of the draw of who happens to be available again. One of the judges admits 88% of the applicants into the US. The other judge admits 5% of the applicants in the US. The lottery that selects one of these two judges determines whether your chances of being admitted are 5% or 88%. That doesn't seem like what the legislator intended when they created asylum courts. Medicine. Medicine is a very rich field for the study of noise, particularly when it comes to imaging. When you look at X-rays, when you look at angiograms, when you look at images that dermatologists look at, it's actually easy to take the same image and show it to 2 different doctors or to 20 different doctors or 100 different doctors and to measure how often they disagree. The answer is much more often than you think. Whenever you get a second opinion, you are probably surprised to notice that it's quite often different from the first opinion. You don't do it very often. What you should worry about is how often the first opinion that you get, and that is the only opinion, is in fact different from what the second opinion would be if you got one. And the reason you should worry is because there is in fact a lot of disagreement. The most extreme example is psychiatry, where really agreement between psychiatrists on what a patient suffers from is the exception, not the rule. It needs to be a pretty clear-cut case for the majority of psychiatrists to agree upon it. Typically, they would disagree, and they would disagree along lines that seem to be shaped by their own training rather than anything else. Where does noise come from? We analyze it, and there's different ways to analyze it. We've chosen to analyze it in a fairly simple way, which will be familiar to you, which is the simple statistical decomposition in 3 blocks. One is what we call level noise, which is the difference in the average level of judgments of different people. So if we take the example of justice again, when we say there are differences between how judges look at the same case, there are differences in the average severity of judges. Every defense attorney will tell you in a courthouse, oh my God, you got this judge. That's bad luck. He's a really tough guy. Whereas if you had gotten that judge, you would have gotten off a lot more easily because he's a much more lenient judge. So that's the average level of the judges across many cases. This, of course, is a difference. We saw the example of the 2 asylum judges. This is an example of level noise. It's very visible. All you have to do is to compare the average level of the judgments of 2 people. That's information that is usually available. And a lot of the examples that we have, like the asylum judges, only measure this type of noise because this can be measured from the existing data. The second type of noise, which I haven't mentioned yet, is more troubling. It's occasion noise. It's the fact that when the same person looks at the same evidence on 2 separate occasions, they won't always give the same answer. I'm sorry. There's 2 ways to show that. You can actually do experiments where you do show the same case on 2 separate occasions to the same judges. Of course, they usually remember the case, so this works only on situations where they cannot remember what they've seen. Take fingerprints, for instance. If you take fingerprint examiners and you show them a decision that they have made a few months ago, but of course they don't recognize it because fingerprints look very much alike, they will typically agree with themselves, but in about 10% of cases, they won't. They will make a different decision from the one that they themselves had made. The other way to measure occasion noise is to use econometric studies where you measure whether some factor that is purely occasion-driven has an impact statistically on the decisions. And if it does, you know that there is occasion noise. That's how we know, for instance, that judges are more lenient after lunch than they are before lunch, that they are more severe when the weather is hot, that they are more likely to send a juvenile delinquent to jail when their favorite football team has lost the game on the Sunday, that they are even more severe when their favorite football team has lost the game and it was an upset. The team had been expected to win, so they are more disappointed by the loss. And when they are more disappointed, they will be more severe. All those variations should not happen, but they do. The same is true in medicine. If you compare how doctors make decisions in the morning with how they make them in the afternoon, the lesson is pretty clear. You should schedule your doctor's appointment first thing in the morning. Avoid doctors in the afternoon. They are not the right time. Level noise and occasion noise are basically a decomposition of between subject and within subject variability. But of course, this leaves us with what we call pattern noise, which is the interaction that is left in this decomposition. And the interaction is simply the fact that how each judge interacts with each case depends on the judge's tastes, on the judge's preferences, on the judge's history, on the judge's personality. To look at it another way, when we take 20 cases and we give them to two different judges, a severe judge and a lenient judge, of course, the average sentence of the severe judge will be longer than the average sentence of the lenient judge, but their ranking of the cases will not be identical. The same case may look like a horrible offense to one of the judges, whereas it will only look like a relatively severe offense to the other judge for reasons that are entirely specific to them and to their personal preferences, histories, and biases. And this turns out, as I'm sure you would guess, to be the largest source of noise. Essentially, the reason our judgments are all different, the main reason our judgments are all different, is that we are all different. And when people believe, as they often do, that making professional judgments is an occasion when they should express themselves, when they should express the quality of their judgment, the insight in their judgment, the individuality in their judgment, that will make their judgments more different, more divergent than they would otherwise be. So this is very briefly what noise is and where it comes from. The second point I'm going to cover very quickly because to you here it is probably obvious, but you should know that to most people out there it's not. Noise is costly. Noise contributes to error as much as bias. This is certainly obvious again to you all, but you may underestimate, as I did until we started giving these talks, you may underestimate the extent to which this idea is counterintuitive. Most people, most lay people to which we talk, most journalists, most business people, have this belief that if on average you're right, it's no big deal that you're wrong in each case. And that as long as there is no bias, the variability in decisions is simply a reflection of the endlessly fascinating nature of human judgments and the wonderful variability of humans, which we should celebrate and not punish. This is, of course, great in many situations. When you ask them, so what about your doctor making mistakes? That suddenly brings them down to earth. But you need to make this case a lot of times with a lot of examples for people to realize what you guys all know, which is that being always wrong does not make you on average right, and that error is the sum of bias and noise. Or more accurately, that mean squared error, as you probably measure it every day, is the sum of the squares of bias and noise. The implication of this, of course, is that whenever we reduce noise, we reduce error. But again, to most lay people, this is deeply counterintuitive because if you bring noise to zero and there is still some bias, you will have decisions that are consistently wrong. And being consistently wrong does not seem to most people to be an improvement over being inconsistently wrong with the same bias. I think this is something that psychologically is very important. Mathematically, it's a no-brainer. Psychologically, it's a completely counterintuitive idea. And frankly, we haven't found a very compelling way to explain this to folks out there who don't have the same familiarity that you have with this equation. So any thoughts about this? I'd happily hear. Having said all this, we all know that noise is damaging. The question of why we neglect it, why people out there neglect it, is interesting. We have two explanations. There is a psychological explanation and an organizational explanation. The psychological explanation, which Danny likes to emphasize because he's the psychologist on this team of writers, is that we are naive realists. We believe that others experience the same reality that we experience. We believe that the world as we see it is the world as it is, and that others, if they are reasonable and well-intentioned, should see it in exactly the same way. That's, of course, part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that in organizations, we suppress differences because we value consensus. So we have all sorts of processes whereby we hide the extent of the disagreements between people. We sweep the dust of the noise under the rug of the enterprise, and we pretend that there is no noise so that we can keep moving forward. The third idea that I wanted to briefly cover, and this, and then we'll move on to your thoughts and questions, is that wherever there is noise, we can actually do something to reduce it. And Lionel was mentioning some of the things that you all do using Bayesian networks, which I'd love to hear about. The practical, I'm going to skip this, which is obvious to you. The practical things that you can do to reduce noise, other than replacing judgment with algorithms, of course, are on the following page. Before we go there, let's be clear, we don't have anything against algorithms. We love algorithms. They are more accurate than people at just about anything. The reason we are focusing on human judgment is because most people disagree with this statement. Most people think that algorithms are terrible. I was just reading a new paper in Nature about the fact that people underestimate how many errors algorithms make, but tolerate even fewer errors, and therefore are not prepared to delegate important decisions to algorithms. There are going to be, for the predictable future, a lot of human decisions that are made in very important domains. And so our main point in the book is not that we are for or against algorithms, it's that we should try to make human judgment better, because for the predictable future, it's going to be very important. How to do this? Well, there are many ways we describe in the book. Let me cover quickly 4, which would be very familiar to you. The first one is to aggregate multiple judgments, which is obvious mathematically, but entirely non-obvious to organizations, because when they aggregate opinions, they tend to create social influence in the process of doing that, and therefore the opinions that they aggregate are not independent of each other. Any process where people talk about decisions before they have actually written down their judgments and made them independently before they do that is actually not reducing noise, it's amplifying noise. It takes special precautions in any organization to maintain the independence of individual judgments, because organizations are machines to produce consensus and to produce social interaction. So aggregation is great, the wisdom of crowds is wonderful, but it simply does not happen if you don't take special steps to do it. And we think it is largely underexploited, to make a long story short. The second idea is that there is a lot less noise in relative measures than in absolute measures. And whenever you can replace absolute judgments with rankings, that's a good idea. This has a lot of applications in HR, for instance. The third idea is to structure judgments and to decompose them into their component parts. Each of the components can then be made relative, as per the previous principle, can also be made by multiple independent people, as per the first principle. And when you combine those principles, you get into a method for aggregating judgments and structuring them, which we call MAP, the Mediating Assessment Protocol, which we believe is a good way to make complex judgments in organizations in general. And the fourth basic idea, I'm going to skip this one. The fourth basic idea is to keep intuition for the end. Intuition is useful. It's not always bad, but early intuition is a big source of noise because it blinds people to contradicting information. It triggers the confirmation bias. It makes the world seem more simple and more coherent than it is actually in reality. And therefore, a good practice is to try to keep your intuition for the end. Then, of course, once you have all the information, you will probably need, if you're a decision maker, you will probably need your gut feeling to tell you that you're making the right direction. That's the right time to use intuition. That's basically the story in a very, very short way. There's a lot more in the book, but there's a lot of noise. It's always costly. It's always a bad thing. It can be measured and reduced through a lot of various techniques without necessarily abdicating our judgment to machines. Again, not that we always think it's a bad idea, but it's not usually a very practical one. This is it. Let me stop sharing my screen and address the questions that I'm sure you have. I see we have 2 hands up, so